You have been lied to about winning. It is not effort versus effort. It is certainty versus doubt. Reality reflects the state that is most calmly occupied. From the standpoint taught by Neville Goddard, creation is already finished. This is not poetic language or philosophical exaggeration. It is a structural claim about consciousness itself. Every conceivable outcome already exists as a state, complete and intact, waiting only to be occupied. When you desire something, you are not requesting that the universe manufacture it, nor are you racing someone else to a limited prize. You are selecting a state, the same way you might select a role in a play that has already been written. The stage does not run out of parts, and it does not award them based on effort, struggle, or moral deserving. It simply reflects which role is being inhabited. This is where the fear-based framing collapses. The question, who wins, assumes that desire is about resources, about objects, people, or circumstances that can be taken, withheld, or lost to another. But desire, as Neville presents it, is about identity. It is about state selection. You are not trying to get something that exists outside of you. You are moving into the position of the one for whom that experience is natural. Scarcity belongs to the level of appearances, not to the level of causation. Consciousness does not compete. It expresses. Neville often used the theatre as an analogy, and it is precise if you take it seriously. There is one stage, one consciousness, and many actors moving through many roles. No actor steals a role from another by playing it convincingly. They simply occupy it while another occupies a different one. The confusion arises only when we identify with the costume instead of the consciousness animating it. When you look at life from the outside, it appears as if people are competing for the same scenes, the same outcomes, the same spotlight. From the inside, from the level of state, there is no rivalry, only correspondence. This is why Abdullah, Neville's teacher, refused to entertain conversations about rivalry, obstacles, or competing wills. Once the state was assumed, discussion ended. Not because questions were forbidden, but because they were irrelevant. To ask who else wants it or what someone else might do is to step out of the assumed state and back into observation, comparison, and doubt. The law does not punish this. It simply reflects it. The moment you look sideways, wondering who might block you, you have already shifted your attention from being to monitoring. So the promise of this discussion is not to reassure you that you will somehow beat others, out-imagine them, or deserve the outcome more. That promise would still be rooted in fear. The real promise is far more dissolving than that. When you understand how reality responds, the question itself loses coherence. It stops making sense, not because it has been answered, but because the framework that required it has fallen away. You realize that nothing is being awarded, nothing is being contested, and nothing is being taken from anyone. There is only the quiet, lawful reflection of the state most steadily lived in. And once this is seen clearly, not intellectually but structurally, the anxiety relaxes. You no longer need to guard your desire or compare your inner work to someone else's outer movement. The law has never asked you to watch the world. It has only ever asked you to remain faithful to what you have accepted as true of yourself. From here, the entire idea of competition begins to feel like a category error, a question asked from a level of thinking that no longer applies. You are not competing with people. You are selecting states. There is a subtle shift that must happen if this law is to make sense at all, and it begins with abandoning the idea that life is negotiated on the level of people. Most confusion comes from watching outcomes and assuming that the visible movement is where causation lives. From that vantage point, it looks as though individuals collide, overlap, interfere, or override one another's plans. But this view mistakes the surface for the source. The law does not operate through people pushing against people. It operates through states being occupied or abandoned. Once this distinction is seen clearly, the entire question of competition starts to loosen its grip. A state is not a mood, and it is not a fleeting thought. A state is a complete position of consciousness, a total way of being that includes assumptions, expectations, reactions, and self-definition. These states are not created when you desire them. They already exist in full form. This is why Neville insisted that creation is finished. When you desire something, you are not initiating a process of making it happen. You are becoming aware of a state that already exists and feeling the pull to occupy it. The law responds only to that occupation, not to the desire itself. An analogy helps here, not because the law is mechanical, but because the structure is precise. Imagine countless radio stations broadcasting simultaneously. Every song, every voice, every message is already in the air at the same time. You do not compete with other listeners to hear a station, and you do not make the broadcast louder by wanting it more intensely. You simply tune the dial. What you hear depends entirely on where the receiver is set. The number of people listening to the same station has no effect on your reception because the broadcast is not depleted by use. States function the same way. Multiple states can be occupied at once by different individuals and even by the same individual at different times. One person's occupation of a state does not block another's access to it because states are not scarce resources distributed by external authority. They are positions in consciousness, infinite in number and independent of one another. The only variable is which one you are tuned to and how steadily you remain there. This is where persistence must be redefined. Many people think persistence means repeating affirmations, visualizing harder, or maintaining emotional intensity in the face of contradictory appearances. But if states are independent of others, then persistence cannot mean defending yourself against competition. It means remaining tuned, without constantly checking the dial to see what everyone else is hearing. The moment you look outward for confirmation or comparison, you introduce static. Not because something has gone wrong, but because attention has shifted. When you truly grasp that you are not in a race, urgency begins to soften. You stop measuring progress by how quickly circumstances move or how others seem to advance. The law does not ask for speed, it responds to stability. A state does not become yours because you outpace someone else. It becomes yours because you stay with it long enough for it to feel natural, familiar, and unquestioned. At that point, the world has no choice but to reflect it, because reflection is its only function. This understanding quietly removes pressure. You no longer need to guard your desire, justify it, or worry about who else might want something similar. The law is not sorting winners and losers among people. It is simply expressing states through form. Once this is seen, persistence stops being a struggle and starts becoming a kind of residence. You are not fighting for a result. You are living from a position, and the rest follows in due order. Anxiety has a very specific meaning within the law, and it is far more diagnostic than people realize. It does not indicate danger, opposition, or an external threat. It reveals movement of attention. The moment concern about others enters the mind, what they are doing, what they might want, how close they are, whether they could interfere, it signals that consciousness has quietly shifted position. You may still be thinking about your desire, but you're no longer thinking from it. That distinction is subtle, yet everything turns on it. When you are truly in a state, there is a kind of psychological privacy that accompanies it. You are not monitoring, scanning, or comparing because there is nothing to defend. The state feels owned in the same effortless way your name feels owned. You do not worry about whether someone else might answer to it or take it from you. You respond naturally because identity has already been accepted. Anxiety only arises when identity is no longer stable, when the mind steps out of being and back into observation. The analogy is simple, but precise. Imagine being given a room that is yours, clearly and legitimately. As long as you remain inside it, settled and at ease, the question of who else might want the room never occurs to you. But the moment you step into the hallway and start checking who else is waiting, who else might enter, or who else has similar access, you have already left the room. The anxiety does not come from the people outside. It comes from no longer occupying what you claim is yours. This is why fear about others is not something to suppress or fix. It is information. It shows that attention has drifted from the end state back into appearances. And appearances always look crowded, competitive, and uncertain because they are effects, not causes. The law never asks you to feel intense, emotionally charged, or constantly vigilant. Those qualities belong to effort, not assumption. Intensity often disguises doubt. Calm, on the other hand, is difficult to counterfeit. Calmness does not mean passivity or indifference. It means inner coherence. When the state is assumed, there is a quiet alignment between what you feel to be true and what you expect to unfold. You are no longer checking whether the law is working, because checking would imply that the verdict is still out. Anxiety always asks for reassurance. Assumption does not ask, it rests. This is why people often report that the moment they stop worrying about others, circumstances begin to reorganize. It is not that the worry was blocking something through force. It is that worry was evidence of divided consciousness. One part was imagining the end, while another part was imagining interference. The law cannot reflect two contradictory states at once. It reflects the one most steadily occupied. When anxiety fades, it is not because you have convinced yourself that no one else matters. It fades because the question itself no longer feels relevant. From within the state, other people are not opponents or obstacles. They are simply part of the arrangement through which the state expresses itself. The mind no longer scans the environment for threats because identity has already been settled internally. So anxiety is not an enemy to fight. It is a signal that attention has wandered. And the moment attention returns to being rather than watching, the nervous energy dissolves on its own. Calmness is not something you manufacture. It is what remains when the state is re-entered and occupied again. When that happens, the concern about others loses its grip because it no longer has a place to stand. Persistence is remaining, not competing. Persistence is one of the most misunderstood words in the entire teaching, largely because it is almost always interpreted through the lens of effort. People hear persistence and imagine repetition, struggle, or a kind of inner endurance, where one must constantly reaffirm belief against resistance. But persistence, as Neville used it, has nothing to do with fighting doubt or overpowering appearances. It describes a far quieter movement, remaining where you have already arrived. When a state is truly assumed, it does not feel fragile. It feels ordinary. You do not wake up each day trying to convince yourself of who you are. You simply move from that position naturally. This is why the idea of competing with others makes no sense from within the state. You do not defend ownership of your name. You do not argue for it, protect it, or compare it to someone else's. You answer to it because it is already accepted as fact. Persistence works the same way. It is not about holding on tightly. It is about not wandering away. Competition implies vigilance. It assumes that something can be lost if attention slips or if someone else moves faster. But states are not maintained by force. They are maintained by familiarity. The more natural a state feels, the less energy it requires to occupy it. This is why effort often signals that the state has not yet been fully entered. You are still visiting it, checking on it, returning to it, rather than living from it. Remaining is a form of loyalty, but not the strained kind. It is the loyalty of recognition. You recognize yourself in the state, and so you stay. When doubt arises, it does not provoke panic, because doubt is seen as a passing thought, not a threat to identity. The state does not collapse every time a contradictory idea appears, just as your sense of self does not dissolve because of a fleeting question. Persistence means allowing thoughts to pass without relocating yourself in response to them. This is also why persistence becomes effortless when the state feels natural. Effort is only required when there is internal disagreement. Once agreement is reached, energy is conserved. The mind no longer oscillates between wanting and fearing, hoping and monitoring. It settles, and from that settlement, the outer world begins to reorganize, not because you are pushing it, but because it must align with the position you are consistently occupying. Many people abandon a state prematurely, not because it failed, but because they mistook the absence of immediate confirmation for contradiction. They return to watching, comparing, and checking, believing they are being responsible or realistic. In truth, they have simply stepped out of the role. The law does not punish this. It waits. The state remains available, unchanged, ready to be occupied again. Persistence, then, is not about endurance over time. It is about continuity of identity. As long as you remain identified with the end, the means will arrange themselves. There is no opponent to outlast, no timeline to beat, and no one to surpass. There is only the quiet requirement of staying where you have already decided to be. When that is understood, persistence stops feeling like work and starts feeling like home. There is a moment in almost everyone's experience with this law where effort quietly replaces assumption, and it usually happens without being noticed. The desire is still there. The techniques may still be practiced, and the language may still sound correct, but something fundamental has shifted. The inner posture is no longer one of being, but of managing outcomes. This is where trying harder enters, and with it, a subtle transfer of power back to appearances. Effort always carries an implication. It implies that the end is not yet secure, that something still needs to be done, adjusted, or intensified in order for reality to comply. On the surface, this can feel responsible or disciplined, but beneath it lies uncertainty. If the state were fully assumed, effort would be unnecessary. You do not strain to be what you already are. The very act of trying reveals that consciousness has stepped out of the end and returned to the process. The analogy of gripping the steering wheel is precise because it exposes this misunderstanding without moral judgment. Gripping harder does not alter the destination. It does not make the road shorter or the arrival more certain. It only reveals anxiety about the journey. In the same way, doubling down on techniques, forcing emotional intensity, or constantly correcting thoughts does not bring the end closer. It reveals doubt about whether the end has truly been accepted. Trying harder also places attention back on the external world, even when it appears inwardly focused. The mind begins to watch for signs, delays, or contradictions, using them as feedback to determine whether more effort is required. This keeps appearances in the position of authority. Reality is no longer something that reflects your state. It becomes something you react to, negotiate with, or attempt to persuade. The law does not respond to persuasion. It responds to assumption. This is why effort often feels exhausting rather than empowering. It requires constant vigilance, constant adjustment, and constant emotional management. The state never quite settles because it is never fully trusted. The mind stays alert, ready to intervene, correct, or compensate. But intervention is unnecessary when completion has already occurred internally. The more you try to ensure the outcome, the more you confirm that you believe it is still uncertain. Letting go of effort does not mean letting go of the desire. It means releasing the need to supervise its arrival. When the end is assumed, the middle is not your responsibility. Trying harder keeps you entangled in the middle, endlessly recalculating how things should unfold. Resting in the state removes that burden. The law takes over the sequencing, timing, and orchestration because that is its function. This understanding naturally prepares the mind for the idea of the Sabbath, not as a spiritual concept, but as a psychological one. If effort implies uncertainty, then rest implies completion. The movement away from trying is not laziness or resignation. It is recognition. It signals that the inner work has reached its conclusion. From here, something different becomes possible. Not more effort, but a deeper kind of stillness where the outcome no longer needs to be chased. The idea of the Sabbath is often misunderstood because it is treated as a spiritual rule rather than a psychological consequence. It is not something you force yourself into, nor is it a discipline you maintain through willpower. The Sabbath arrives on its own quietly when the inner act has reached completion. It is the natural pause that follows certainty, and it is here, in this pause, that the illusion of competition finally dissolves. When something is finished inwardly, negotiation stops. There is no longer a conversation about how, when, or through whom it will occur. The mind no longer revisits alternative scenarios or scans the environment for threats or rivals. The analogy of a signed contract captures this perfectly. Once the agreement is complete, discussion ends. No one continues to bargain after the terms have been settled. The matter is closed, not because it was suppressed, but because it was resolved. The Sabbath is not inactivity in the outer sense. Life continues, decisions are made, and actions unfold as they normally would. What changes is the inner posture. There is no longer a sense of urgency tied to outcomes. You are no longer leaning forward into the future, trying to ensure that events line up correctly. The future feels settled, and so attention returns to the present without strain. This is not indifference, it is relief. Competition cannot exist in this state, because competition requires unfinished business. It requires uncertainty, comparison, and the belief that something is still undecided. The Sabbath ends all of that. Once the state is accepted as fact, the question of who else might want the same thing loses its emotional charge. It may still appear as a thought, but it carries no weight. It does not provoke reaction, because there is nothing left to protect. Rest in this sense is not a technique, it is evidence. It shows that the mind has stopped interfering. There is no longer a need to rehearse the desire, reinforce belief, or check progress. The inner work has done its job. The state feels complete, whole, and sufficient on its own. From this position, the outer world is free to reorganize without resistance. This is why Neville described the Sabbath as the sign that the work is finished. Not finished in the sense that something has appeared on the surface, but finished where it actually matters. The law does not require constant attention once the assumption is made. In fact, constant attention often indicates that the assumption has not yet been trusted. The Sabbath marks the moment when trust replaces effort. When rest is genuine, it carries a distinct quality. There is a lightness, a subtle easing of mental tension, as though something that needed guarding no longer does. The desire no longer feels like a task to manage. It feels settled, even inevitable. And in that inevitability, the entire framework of winning and losing collapses. There is nothing to win once the outcome has already been accepted as yours. Relief is the evidence the inner act is done. Relief is often overlooked because it is quiet, and the mind tends to associate progress with intensity rather than ease. Yet relief is one of the most reliable indicators that the inner act has reached completion. It does not arrive with excitement or emotional fireworks. It arrives as a soft release, a subtle easing that feels almost ordinary. And precisely because it feels ordinary, it is easy to miss its significance. When the state has been fully assumed, something in the nervous system settles. The mental tension that once surrounded the desire begins to dissolve, not through effort, but through resolution. You are no longer bracing for disappointment or rehearsing explanations for delay. The inner conversation quiets. This is not because you have convinced yourself to stop thinking about the desire, but because there is nothing left to resolve. The mind senses closure. The analogy of setting down a burden you forgot you were carrying captures this perfectly. You do not celebrate the act of putting it down, you do not analyze it. You simply notice afterward that your shoulders feel lighter and your breathing is easier. Relief works the same way. It is often recognized in retrospect when you realize that the urgency is gone and the question no longer presses for an answer. This is why relief always precedes outer change. The law does not wait for circumstances to shift before easing the mind. The easing comes first because it signals that the assumption has stabilized. Once the inner act is complete, there is no reason for strain. The mind is no longer split between wanting and watching. It has accepted the outcome as settled, even if appearances have not yet caught up. Relief also has an important side effect. It collapses unnecessary questions. When the inner act is done, the mind no longer circles around possibilities involving other people. The concern about who else might want the same thing, who might interfere, or how events will unfold loses its emotional charge. These questions may still arise as abstract thoughts, but they no longer demand attention. They feel irrelevant because the core issue has already been resolved. This is not detachment in the sense of withdrawal. It is emotional closure. The desire no longer feels open-ended or precarious. It feels concluded, even while life continues to move. From this position, patience becomes natural, not forced. Waiting does not feel like waiting. It feels like living, with the quiet understanding that something is already in motion without your supervision. Relief is not something you manufacture. It cannot be forced or imitated. It appears when the mind has stopped arguing with itself. And when it appears, it carries a clear message. The inner work is finished. At that point, the world has only one function left, to reflect what has already been accepted as true. Once relief is present, the question of others fades, not because it was answered, but because it no longer matters. From the surface, life often appears competitive. Events seem to favor one person over another, outcomes look exclusive, and circumstances give the impression that reality must choose who receives what. But this interpretation comes from observing effects without understanding their cause. The world is not a judge, an arbitrator, or a distributor of rewards. It does not pick sides. It reflects states, and it does so impersonally, without preference or intention. What appears as competition is only the overlapping of results, not the collision of causes. Causes do not exist on the level of people, they exist on the level of consciousness. When two individuals seem to want the same thing, the mind assumes conflict because it is trained to think in terms of limited objects and shared timelines. But the law does not operate through objects or timelines. It operates through states, and states never compete. They simply express. This is why the world can reorganize itself without struggle or confrontation. No one needs to lose in order for another to gain. No decision is made about who deserves what. Instead, circumstances quietly reshuffle to match the inner position being occupied. Paths diverge, opportunities shift, roles change, and timing adjusts, often so subtly that the reordering is only recognized afterward. What looked like rivalry from the outside reveals itself as coordination when seen from a higher level. The analogy of water filling a container is useful precisely because it removes judgment. Water does not assess the container or compare it to another. It simply takes the shape it is given. Consciousness functions the same way. The outer world takes the shape of the assumption most consistently lived in. If the assumption changes, the form changes. No favoritism is involved. This also explains why watching others is so misleading. Comparing outcomes assumes that the external situation is the deciding factor, but situations are reflections, not causes. Two people may appear to desire the same result, yet be occupying entirely different inner positions. One may be settled in the feeling of fulfillment, while the other remains in anticipation or uncertainty. The world does not choose between them. It mirrors each one accordingly. When this is understood, the sense of threat dissolves. There is no need to monitor what others are doing, or fear that someone else's movement can interfere with your own. The law is not a competition engine, it is a mirror, and a mirror does not argue, negotiate, or compare. It simply reflects what stands before it. There is a point in this teaching where explanation ends and assumption begins, and that point is the state akin to sleep. Sats is not emphasized because it is mystical or ceremonial, but because it is the condition in which resistance is lowest and identity is most impressionable. In this state, the mind is no longer busy evaluating, correcting, or comparing. It is receptive, inwardly quiet, and willing to accept an idea as true without immediately arguing against it. What is accepted in SATS carries a different quality than thoughts entertained during the day. It does not feel tentative or hypothetical. It feels settled. This is why Neville described it as the seal of occupancy. You are not imagining something happening. You are accepting yourself as the one for whom it is already so. The emphasis is not on imagery or effort, but on the shift in being that occurs when the assumption is allowed to take root without interference. The analogy of warm wax receiving a stamp captures this process with precision. When the wax is soft, the impression enters easily and remains. There is no need to press repeatedly or check whether it worked. Once the wax cools, the form is fixed. In the same way, a state accepted in SATS does not require constant reinforcement afterward. It has already been impressed at a level deeper than conscious management. This is where the entire idea of competition collapses. In SATS, there is no comparison with others, no awareness of obstacles, and no concern about timing. You are not imagining against anyone or protecting an outcome. You are simply occupying a state directly. From this position, the question of who else might want the same thing no longer has relevance, because the state is not treated as a possibility, but as a fact. What follows this acceptance is not obsession, but rest. The mind does not feel compelled to revisit the desire repeatedly because it no longer feels unfinished. Life continues, but the inner argument has ended. This sense of completion is often subtle, yet unmistakable. It carries a quiet confidence that does not need validation. Because the state has been claimed, the world is now free to reorganize around it without your supervision. Events, timing, and circumstances adjust on their own, not through effort, but through correspondence. SATS marks the moment where the inner act is done. Once that happens, nothing needs to be defended or monitored. The question was never about who would win. It dissolves the moment the state is truly occupied. The one who wins is the one who remains. Reality does not reward effort or rivalry. It reflects the state most steadily lived in. Competition is an appearance, not a cause. No one can take what you have already become. When the inner act is complete, fulfillment follows naturally.